This is a story that got virtually no coverage at all, but we need to know about this stuff because it's really, really critical. The Supreme Court accepted a case. They're going to hear a case. We're not sure exactly when, but presumably, well, we'll see. Presumably in the fall, and then they'll issue an opinion presumably in the spring of next year. But it could all move much, much faster than that. And if they rule the way it looks like they're going to rule, if they rule based on things that Neil Gorsuch has said, things that Clarence Thomas has written, things that, and the West Virginia versus EPA case that the six Republicans on the court, the six corrupt Republicans on the court all voted for, to prevent the EPA from regulating carbon dioxide. That was just last year. If they rule the way that we think they are, then the EPA will no longer be able to regulate polluters. The U.S. Department of Agriculture will no longer be able to keep our food supplies safe. The Food and Drug Administration will no longer be able to oversee drugs coming onto the market. OSHA will no longer be able to protect workers. The Consumer Product Safety Commission will no longer keep dangerous toys and consumer products off the shelves. The FTC will no longer be able to regulate monopolies. The Department of Transportation will no longer be able to come up with highway and automobile safety standards. The ATF won't be able to regulate guns. The Interior Department will lose its power over regulating drilling and mining on federal lands. The Forest Service won't be able to protect our woodlands and rivers. The Department of Labor won't be able to protect workers' rights. And on it goes. I mean, those are just the agencies that I was able to pull off the top of my head. There's a bunch of other federal agencies. Basically, what the Supreme Court said with the West Virginia versus EPA case, what Clarence Thomas has said in a dissent to another case a couple of years ago, is that if Congress creates an agency, well, let me back up a little bit. Here's how it works. Congress creates an agency, like let's take the Environmental Protection Agency as an example. Congress wrote legislation saying, we want a clean environment, so we're going to create an agency that can oversee things that might damage the environment, and that's the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA then says, okay, we've got to establish some standards for pollutants, for atmospheric pollutants. So let's start out with carbon dioxide, for example. And so we'll bring in a group of scientists, or we've got our in-house scientists, and they'll look at the situation and they'll come up with what they think are the best solutions to the problem. They'll then bring in experts from across the board, industry experts, green experts, whatever, and they'll offer their opinions on it. They will craft an initial proposed draft, a new rule, a new EPA rule for regulating carbon dioxide. They actually did all this. They went through this whole process. That rule will then be presented to the public, and it will be available for 6 months for public comment on the website of the Environmental Protection Agency. And after 1 million or so people have commented on the rule, then the EPA will decide whether or not to put it into place. If they put it into place, then that's the new rule, right? That's the law, essentially. Well, what happened in the West Virginia versus EPA case is that the six corrupt Republican appointees on the Supreme Court came forward and said, the legislation that created the Environmental Protection Agency does not mention the two words carbon dioxide, does not mention them. And therefore, you can't regulate carbon dioxide. Now, that legislation also doesn't mention dioxins. It doesn't mention DDT. It doesn't mention dicambate. It doesn't mention any of the things that the EPA can regulate, right? And they already took away the EPA's ability to regulate carbon dioxide from power plants. So power plants are now spitting out carbon dioxide like there was no tomorrow, or there is no tomorrow. So with this new case that the Supreme Court has taken up, and by the way, this all started with Ann Gorsuch. Ronald Reagan put Ann Gorsuch in charge of the EPA back in 1981. And in her first year heading that agency, there was a 79% decline in enforcement cases, a 69% drop in cases the EPA referred to the Justice Department for prosecution, and she got a 25% cut in her own agency's budget. It took Congress years to undo the damage that Ann Gorsuch did to the EPA. And finally, she was forced to resign because of what Newsweek called, quote, a nasty scandal involving political manipulation, Superfund mismanagement, perjury, and destruction of subpoenaed documents, among other things. She resigned to avoid prosecution. Well, now her son's on the Supreme Court. And she wrote in her memoir that when she resigned, her son was very, very upset. He said, you never should have resigned. You didn't do anything wrong. You just did what Reagan ordered you to do. So, you know, it looks like Neil Gorsuch is fixing to get his revenge. And if he does, America is going to function very differently than it has historically. This will throw us back to the pre-1930s when the first agency that came along was in 1908. It was, the what is now the U.S. Department of Agriculture to oversee slaughterhouses as a result of, Sinclair Lewis's The Jungle, or Upton Sinclair. I think it was Upton Sinclair's book. I mixed them up. But, now we've got all these regulatory agencies, and the Supreme Court looks like they want to shut them down.